Somewhere inside every single cell in your body there is a scar. A molecular record of something that happened 1.2 million years ago that scientists can read but cannot explain. And what it says is this: at some point in that window, the entire breeding population of the human lineage, every individual whose genes would eventually lead to every person alive today, may have been reduced to approximately 1,280 individuals. Not a city. Not a town. Not a village. An apartment complex. That is the number. 1,280 breeding individuals carrying the entire genetic future of humanity on this planet. One epidemic. One volcanic winter. One decade of failed rains. And this conversation never happens. Here is the first thing to understand, and it changes everything. That number is not a census. Nobody counted. Nobody was there with a clipboard marking down names. What geneticists calculated is called the effective population size, the number of individuals who were actually contributing genes to future generations in a sustained way. The actual number of humans walking the earth during this period was almost certainly higher than 1,280. But the genetic diversity passing forward through time was equivalent to what you would expect from a founding population of that size. The rest, the groups that existed but left no descendants, the lineages that ended in drought and darkness, the people who survived but whose children did not, they contributed nothing to us. From the perspective of our DNA, they might as well have never been. This is the East African Rift Valley approximately 1.2 million years ago. The same geography where the human story began. A wide river threading through grassland and volcanic rock. Herds of large herbivores on the slopes. A small group of Homo erectus at the riverbank, early humans, recognizably us from the neck down, subtly different from the neck up. Pronounced brow ridge. Lower, longer skull. A brain roughly 2/3 the size of yours. But a body built for the same things, walking, running, carrying, tracking, processing what the land provided. They were not struggling. Not yet. The river was full. The valley was productive. Their stone tools, the teardrop-shaped Acheulean hand axe, bifacially worked with a precision that required skill and transmitted knowledge, were the most advanced technology on Earth. But the mud at the river's edge was already telling a story. The river was slightly lower than it should be. The herd that grazed the upper slope had moved. Not far. Not dramatically. But the oldest member of the group, the one whose deeply lined face carried decades of seasonal pattern recognition, had seen this before. She knew what a lower river in early season meant. She knew because someone had told her. And she had told the others. This is what makes the bottleneck story psychologically disturbing. It was not sudden. It was not one catastrophic morning when everything ended at once. It was a slow squeeze. A sustained compression of diversity lasting tens of thousands of years. Populations thinning not in a single apocalypse but through the accumulated weight of bad decades, fewer animals, less reliable water, narrowing migration corridors, fragmented groups that could no longer reach each other across landscapes that were slowly turning hostile. Not a disaster movie. A slow-motion siege. And the people inside it had no way to know the siege had begun. The climate machine that was doing this to them had a name, though they could not know it. Geologists call it the Mid-Pleistocene transition. It marks the moment when the planet's ice age rhythm changed. Before approximately 1.2 million years ago, Earth's glacial cycles operated on a roughly 41,000-year pulse, driven primarily by the tilt of the planet's axis. Glaciers advanced and retreated on a relatively predictable schedule. Ecosystems could shift with them. Animals could follow their food sources. Climate was harsh but it was patterned, and pattern is something living systems can adapt to. Then the rhythm broke. The cycles stretched to 100,000 years. The glacials got longer. The glacials got colder. The warm interglacials between them, the brief windows of productivity and expansion, got shorter. And within each cycle, the swings became more violent. temperature lurches of 10 degrees Celsius occurring over decades rather than millennia. Greenland ice core data shows these events as abrupt vertical lines in the record, not gradual slopes but cliffs. For a Homo erectus group with a lifespan of 30 to 40 years, a climate shift that played out across a single generation was not a geological abstraction. It was the world changing under their feet while they were still trying to live in it. The dust storm that hit the Rift Valley in our story is a physical expression of that changed world. Dust storms of this magnitude are the product of desiccated landscapes, ground that has lost its vegetation cover and has no root systems holding the soil. They are the visible sign that rainfall has failed across a large area for a sustained period. The air haze that followed, that slightly wrong quality of the light, the sun slightly dimmed, the colors slightly muted, is a different phenomenon entirely. That is volcanic aerosol. Sulfur dioxide injected into the upper atmosphere from a large eruption hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, diffusing the sunlight, reducing photosynthesis, shortening growing seasons in every region it reaches. Both of these are evidence of the same underlying process, a world in which the mechanisms that supported large stable populations of animals and the humans who depended on them were failing simultaneously, from multiple directions, on overlapping timescales. The dust storm takes a season to end. The volcanic haze takes a year or two to clear. The rainfall deficit that produced the dust storm in the first place may take decades to reverse. For Homo erectus groups already operating at the margins of what their landscape could provide, each of these events was not an isolated disaster. It was another layer on top of layers already present. Another system failing while the previous system's failure had not yet resolved. The response of the group in our story, finding the fire-starting tools, maintaining the hearth through the storm, moving toward the Highland Spring, is not metaphorical. Fire maintenance under adverse conditions required skill, accumulated knowledge, and specific materials gathered in advance. Groups that had internalized the habit of fire management, that had made it cultural, that had woven it into their social structure so that someone always knew how and always carried the materials, were groups that could sustain warmth and cooked food when the landscape around them failed. Groups that may not have had a second chance to learn. The Highland Spring is what ecologists call a refugium. A location where conditions remain viable even when the surrounding region has become inhospitable. During the worst phases of the Mid-Pleistocene transition, refugia were what kept the human lineage alive. Not one single refugium, many. Scattered across Africa and possibly parts of Eurasia, each one a pocket of stable climate, reliable water, or persistent food supply in a landscape where all three were failing across the broader region. A refugium might be a deep rift valley with springs fed by groundwater rather than rainfall, water that kept flowing even when the rainy season shortened or disappeared. It might be a coastal strip where ocean currents maintained a milder, more predictable climate even as the interior dried. It might be a mountain region where elevation gradients meant that as one vegetation zone failed, another upslope or downslope remained viable. The Highland Spring in our story is all three of these things compressed into one location: reliable water, buffered microclimate, and the topographic shelter of the escarpment walls. But refugia were also traps. Once you were in one, leaving was harder and harder as conditions around it deteriorated. Venture too far from the spring, the mountain stream, the coastal shellfish beds, and you hit empty country, dry plains with no reliable water, no predictable food, vast stretches that might take days to cross. The landscape that in a good climate year was a connected network of habitable zones became, in a prolonged drought, a series of isolated islands surrounded by the equivalent of open ocean. You could see the next island. You could not safely reach it. What the scene at the Highland Spring shows, two groups arriving at the same refugium, testing each other, exchanging a piece of raw flint as a social gesture, eventually sharing a fire and a knowledge transmission, is the genetic mechanism of a bottleneck playing out at the human scale. Effective population size does not decrease only when people die. It decreases when populations become isolated from each other and stop exchanging genes. Groups that never meet, never mate, never share knowledge, each one is a separate genetic experiment, and most experiments fail. The groups that maintained connections across distance, that treated a shared water source as a social opportunity rather than a conflict trigger, that passed raw flint and tool-making technique and knowledge of seasonal resources between them, these were the groups whose genetic contributions compounded across generations rather than dead-ending in one failed season. The 1280 is not just a number about deaths. It is a number about connections. The effective population is not 1280 because only 1280 humans existed. It is 1280 because only the genetic diversity of approximately 1280 connected, mating, reproducing individuals was passing forward through time. The rest, the isolated groups in valleys too far from the network, the coastal populations cut off by advancing deserts, the highland bands whose refugium eventually also failed, contributed nothing to us. They existed. They survived for years or generations. They had children. And then the chain ended. The spring in our story is where two chains connected and became one longer chain. The coastal refugium and the mountain stream valley are not the same group. They are not communicating. They may be separated by hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. But they are the same story, the same species, under the same planetary pressure, responding with the same fundamental logic. Find the water, stay near it, use what is available in this specific location with this specific set of tools and this specific accumulated knowledge. Each refugium is running its own experiment in survival. And most experiments fail eventually. The coastal shellfish collectors have something the highland spring group does not, a food source that is not dependent on rainfall. Shellfish beds do not dry up in a drought. The intertidal zone continues to produce food regardless of what the inland climate is doing, as long as the sea remains at roughly the same level and temperature. But sea levels during glacial periods drop dramatically, as much as 100 meters below current levels, as water is locked up in expanding ice sheets. The coastal plain that supported shellfish beds in one phase becomes dry exposed shelf in another. The shoreline moves. The ecosystem moves with it. And the people who depended on it must move or starve or adapt. This is the specific cruelty of the Mid-Pleistocene transition for every refugium that sustained human life. The refugium that worked in one climate phase might not work in the next. The highland spring was reliable in the current drought but might not survive a sustained cooling phase that reduced the snowmelt feeding it. The coastal shellfish beds existed during this interglacial but would be exposed land during the next glacial maximum. The mountain stream ran clear in this decade but might be disrupted by the next large volcanic eruption in the regional field. Nothing was permanently safe. Everything that sustained a refugium population was itself contingent on the next climate swing. The dry lake bed in the story, the former body of water now a flat white salt plain with the bones of animals that died when the water left, is the outcome of a refugium that failed. A lake that once sustained a dense and productive ecosystem, that once served as a guaranteed water and food source for the Homo erectus groups around it, is now a monument to what happens when the climate swing exceeds the refugium's capacity to buffer it. There were groups around this lake. They do not appear in our DNA. Their chains ended here, in a landscape that promised permanence and delivered collapse. The scene of Sura, the oldest group member, most deeply lined face, white-streaked hair, teaching a flint napping technique to a younger member of the joined second group is where the bottleneck story becomes something other than a story of disaster. It is a story about what passed through the bottleneck and why. Knowledge. Specifically the kind of knowledge that cannot be reinvented quickly, the accumulated, body-level, practice-dependent knowledge of how to make a specific tool from a specific material using a specific sequence of strikes. If Sura had died before this moment, before this joining of groups, that knowledge might have died with her in a group of 3. Transmitted to the larger group, it will outlast her by generations. This is what the genetic bottleneck preserved, not just people, but practices. Not just chromosomes, but the cultural toolkit that made the chromosome carriers capable of surviving the next swing. When the landscape began to recover, when the milky volcanic aerosol haze cleared from the upper atmosphere, when the river began to fill again, when the first thin line of new green grass appeared along the dried riverbank, the survivors expanded back into it. Not as a wave. Not as a triumphant repopulation. As a careful testing of a landscape that had recently been lethal, individuals and small groups moving down from the highland spring, moving up from the coastal strip, emerging from the mountain valleys, checking whether the water was back, whether the herds had returned, whether the corridors between refugia were passable again. This is the moment that the bottleneck produced. Not just survivors, but specific survivors, the groups that had maintained fire, maintained knowledge transmission, maintained the social connections that allowed refugia to become exchange nodes rather than dead ends. The groups that had shared the highland spring for weeks and taught each other tool-making techniques. The groups that had figured out how to harvest the coastal intertidal zone in a climate phase where the inland was dying. The groups that had kept moving toward higher ground when the lower ground failed, rather than staying and hoping the lower ground would recover before they ran out of time. Here is what the number 1280 means in the genetics laboratory. A researcher runs a computational model backward through modern human genomes, tracing the lineages, measuring the coalescent events, reading the shared DNA segments whose length tells you how old the bottleneck was. And the model produces a number. Not a count of bodies. A measurement of genetic behavior. The genomes of every human alive today carry the specific statistical signature of a population that at some point in the deep past behaved as if it was approximately 1,280 breeding individuals in size. The diversity is there to read. The scar is there in the chromosomes. The bottleneck happened. What caused it? What combination of the Mid-Pleistocene climate transition, the volcanic eruptions, the shifting coastlines, the failed lakes, the disease running through already stressed populations, the isolation of groups that could no longer reach each other across dying landscapes, is still being argued in research journals published last year. The cause is unknown. The fact is not. Every single person watching this carries in their DNA the scar of what happened to 1,280 individuals in a series of African refugia and possibly a few Eurasian pockets 1.2 million years ago. Every person with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa also carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, the genetic record of what happened when the descendants of those 1,280 survivors eventually met the other branches of the human family that diverged from the same pre-bottleneck lineage. The bottleneck did not just nearly end us. It shaped exactly what we became on the other side of it, more flexible, more cooperative, more capable of sustained knowledge transmission across generations, more willing to share a fire with a stranger at a highland spring in a valley where both groups have arrived desperate and uncertain. Because the groups that were not willing to do that did not produce descendants. The 1,280 that did are the reason this sentence exists. The footprint in the river mud is one of theirs. It will fill with water and disappear within the hour. The DNA it represents is in your body right now.